Alex, over to you. Good luck and enjoy your talk.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so my name's Alex. I'm going to be talking about using L1 in the classroom. Perhaps the first thing to say is actually about myself. I'm a monolingual English speaker. So perhaps this is a strange topic for me to actually talk about. Most of my career I've not used L1 in the classroom at all, purely for the reason that I haven't understood my students' L1. So I'd like to start by asking, who does use L1 in the classroom? Do we have any teachers who use L1? Okay, so I can see from the responses we've got some yeses, some not at all, some sometimes or occasionally. Okay, so I think I've not used it, as I say, one for the reason that I didn't know my students L1, but I think there's another reason as well, which is that for some reason I accepted that it wasn't helpful for learning a language. And I've asked myself, why did I accept that? Where did I hear that? Probably, I imagine it was on my CELTA or when I was first starting out as a teacher. And so I wanted to look at the reasons why so many teachers accept that L1 is just wrong. So I found these 3 reasons. So again, I'd like to ask you to think about these reasons. Do you agree? Do you disagree? What do you think? Okay, so again, we've got some interesting opinions. A few agrees there. Number 1 seems contentious with some people. Number 2 also seems contentious. So before we look at these in a bit more detail, do you know what approach actually put forward these 3 ideas? Yeah, so I think Chris was first with the direct method. So yeah, it's the direct or natural approach. So this is the thinking of more than 100 years ago, which of course a lot has changed in terms of how we understand language and how we understand teaching in that time. But the reasons why we still say don't use L1 haven't really changed. So let's have a look at these in a bit more detail. So the first one, that L1 takes away time from using English. Well, I think at first that appears very valid. If I'm talking in my student's L1 for 2 minutes, that's 2 minutes that I'm not giving them input in English. And similarly, if the students are talking in L1, that's time they're not talking in English. But what if it actually generates some discussion? So before we get our students to discuss a topic, it might help them to collectively think of the vocabulary, of the phrases that they might actually need. And I can see someone's already beat me to my next point, Lisa, which is, yes, it could also save time. So sometimes we might, that's okay, Lisa, we might spend a lot of time actually trying to create a context for a bit of language, when actually we just need to provide a quick translation. It's maybe not the main point of the lesson at all. We just want to provide a quick translation there, something that's maybe just impossible for students to, for us to actually elicit from students anyway. So we can save a lot of time there as well, that's true. The second point about L1 preventing students from thinking in English, I did see that someone said about the level at which people actually start to think in English might actually not be below C1 anyway. But there's another problem with this argument, which is that it assumes that languages are stored and dealt with separately, as the diagram here. We know that that's actually not the case. If we look at translanguaging, we can see that people use the languages even at the same time. So perhaps the diagram should be more like this, where there's some overlap. Although what I find more helpful is to think of it more like this, like a spectrum. It's one big linguistic resource, and I think you can see this even if you just look at one language and you see how people take different parts of the linguistic spectrum that they have. So like formal and informal language might be at different ends. They use different language with different people. I think that actually when we look at how languages are stored and how we use languages, this diagram makes much more sense than two separate areas. I think Guy Cook actually summed this up, this kind of idea quite well, that learners aren't learning languages to become separately monolingual, that there isn't this split between I'm an English speaker, I'm a Russian speaker, or whatever else. But it's about building a bilingual identity. It's about one linguistic resource, essentially. And the third is the argument that translation leads to a defective knowledge of English. Well, the problem with this is really the word defective. Because if something is defective, it implies that something can be perfect. And therefore that the goal for our students is perfection. But when I think about that, as a native English speaker, is my language perfect? I would certainly argue not. In terms of my vocabulary, for example, there are something like 500,000 words in the Oxford English Dictionary, and I certainly don't know all of those. So I can't say my language is perfect, and I don't see that I can insist that my students' language should be perfect. So what should it be? Well, we can say that speakers have an emergent level of English, even native speakers. Everybody has an emergent level of English. And what we need is to get that level to where people need to be. So, for example, even as a native speaker, I understand in 99.9% of the situations that I'm in. Maybe there's very occasionally a word of some technical jargon or something that I don't understand. And this is really where we want to move students towards, is where they are able to actually communicate in most situations that they need to. It's not about perfection as such. If we chase perfection, we'll never meet it. So it's not a good goal to have. So really, I hope I've convinced anybody who thought that no, we shouldn't use L1 at all. Maybe that there are perhaps some times when using L1 is actually a good idea. And I've been through through a lot of literature in terms of finding when would be a good idea to use it. And I've actually compiled this list. So here it is. And I think I've got a few more minutes, so I'll just talk through a couple of these. So first of all, presenting abstract lexis or constructs and checking understanding of the same. Certainly, we don't need to use L1 to present something that's a concrete vocabulary item, something that we can see easily. We can show that in a picture, we can maybe do it through gesture, through all different ways that we would normally use. But there are some things that are so abstract, the only way to really show them is perhaps to just give a quick translation, and it's just going to be much quicker. Someone has just mentioned false friends, of course. Yeah, they are a problem. False friends are something that we refer to as a negative transfer. But when we actually think about the two languages together, there are often many more occasions of positive transfer. So avoiding using L1 just because they might confuse two words, well, actually it might help them to understand a great deal more words by comparing them. So also, if we're giving complex instructions above the level of our students, well, again, we're just going to make problems for ourselves if students aren't going to understand these instructions. Perhaps it's better to give the instruction in both languages so that they hear both versions, or even just the difficult parts of the instructions. We can give those, and we can give the English at the same time, so that in the future, students will get to know these instructions. As a break from English, I don't know what people feel about that one. Yeah, perhaps learning a language is tiring after a certain amount of time. They perhaps need a break. Okay, yeah, I'm trying to read the comments at the same time as well. Yeah, translation is on there, which was my next point. Yeah, there are lots of ways to do translation. One of the books I read in putting this together was Philip Kerr's book on translation activities, which has all kinds of things such as back translating and looking at the way that, well, looking at the problems with online translation tools and understanding why bad translations happen. Actually, another writer that I read also suggested that translating should even be considered one of the, well, it would then become 5 main skills. So in addition to reading and writing and so on, we would also have translating, because our students do regularly do that when they are actually using their language with their friends and so on. So, yeah, in addition, reliability and validity of testing. Oh, hold on, there's a question there. A good idea to teach the speaks L1 if all of them shared one. Well, yeah, I think a lot of these ideas only work if you actually have one shared L1. There are other things you can do if you have different L1s in the class. But, for example, giving instructions, if you've got many different first languages, it's going to take even longer to give everybody a different set of instructions, and you'll need to know, all of their languages as well. So I think a lot of what I was looking at was in the context of monolingual classes, actually. Okay, so I think I'm being given the light to end my talk now. So just to say the last thing, I've also included in the slides some further reading. So if you're interested in finding out more, you can find more information. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Alex. Sorry, my microphone was being silly. Thank you very much, Alex. Enjoyed that. The topic of L1, L2 is always one that causes much discussion, as is happening on the chat box at the moment. So thank you for joining us and taking part in today's conference. Can I ask you to go off microphone and turn off your camera? Chris Ozog, if you're listening, now is a good time to quickly test your camera while we take a couple of minutes just to switch over. So if you want to test your camera, Viera, you're next up, yeah? Okay, so Viera, could you try your camera for me? Can you see us? So thanks, Grace.
Yeah, I do.
Can you see yourself? Can you once you see yourself, can you press